All right, I'm going to keep it short and relatively swiftly to the point. I'm going to use a little bit of specialized terminology. If I say lithics or lithic technology, that means stone tools. And I'm basically a stone tool using human who became an archaeologist. The lens through which I view human evolution is lithic records, stone tool evidence. So that's a very biased perspective, but it's my perspective, and you should know that going into this. All right. I'm a stone tool using human who became an archaeologist. Now, this is kind of ironic if you think about it. Stone tools were as little as 400, 500 years ago, some of the most common things people would know about here in California. If this was a conference taking place 500 years ago, every single person in this audience would know how to make stone tools. They probably would be making stone tools right now. How many of you guys are making stone tools right now? There you go. Good. It's good habit. Within paleoanthropology, my main area of interest is the early archaeology of our species, the archaeology of Homo sapiens before 100,000 years ago. I pursued this in two different areas. One in the region of, my colleague, Mike Petraglia referred to as the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, where we have human fossils dating from about 90,000 years ago back to 130,000 years ago, from the Skoll and Kasta caves in Israel. I've also conducted research on the early Homo sapiens archaeology in Ethiopia at the Omo Kibish locality. Those are little artifacts at the 6 o'clock position. There are some stone points we found together with the Omo Kibish fossils. Now, as I see it, viewed through the stone tool evidence, the Great Human Diaspora involves at least 5 major movements. First, an early one within Africa, 400,000 years ago. A dispersal into southern Asia that stopped at Wallace's line there briefly and then continued on to Sahul, a term we use for Pleistocene Australia and New Guinea. A movement into what paleontologists call the Mammoth Steppe across northern Asia and into Europe, and then movement here to the New World. And each of these movements is correlated with differences in the stone tool record. But I'm not going to talk very much about that. It's a long and complicated subject. I'd probably put you all to sleep, except you. Another subject that's interested me in the course of my research is the development of complex projectile technology. Now, complex projectile technology involves a weapon system that has a separate missile and launcher component. So, put simply, bow and arrow, spear-throw radar, those sorts of things. Now, when I look at the stone tool evidence associated with Homo sapiens dispersal of these major geographic regions, I can see a pattern. In the very earliest occurrences of Homo sapiens in Africa lack evidence for complex projectile weaponry. The complex projectile weaponry is also absent from the archaeological contexts with early South Asians and early Australians and stuff. Then it appears in Africa around a little after 100,000 years ago, places like those curves described in other localities. And then it shows up together with early human fossils in the Mammoth Steppe in the Americas. If I wanted to, I could make a really cool story about how projectile technology enabled us to do all these wonderful things, become such marvelous primates. But that'd be stupid, and I'm not going to do it. I know I'm not done. Here's why. One of the major problems we have in human origins research is that we confuse the pattern that we find in the evidence with the process that created it. These are 4 major issues in terms of conflating pattern with process that I think are really important for us to reflect upon. First among these is that we're trying to study population movements by hunter-gatherers, and yet all of our models for how people move around the landscape are based on recent population movements or migrations by people who are farmers or people who are pastoralists. Now, these kinds of people who have farms, people who have livestock, they don't move very fast. They have to keep up with their animals, and they have to wait for their crops to grow. So this idea that we can trace human dispersals by hunter-gatherers slowly across the landscape, it's probably wrong. The second problem is that partly because archaeology began in Europe, we've indexed on that archaeological record. Now, indexing is a term psychologists use for when the first observation in the series influences your perception of subsequent observations. So what this means is that because archaeologists began excavating in Europe, we expect the first humans to appear everywhere else to act like age Europeans. That's just stupid. People in Australia don't act like Aboriginal Australians in the 18th century didn't act like 18th century Englishmen. human behavior varies. Further problem that we have, third one, is that when we try to correlate the archaeological record, the fossil record, and increasingly the genetic record, we have to ask ourselves, why do we expect them to be correlated? Now, when we find correlations, we can come up with some very fancy, elaborate ways of explaining them, but these are discovered correlations, not correlations predicted by prior theory. And when we find any of these correlations, and the human mind is good at finding correlations, we have to first ask ourselves, are these correlations spurious ones? The sort of odd sort of thing you might find that left-handed people like the color green. Why? That's an important question. If you've got a reason for expecting left-handed people to like the color green, then find the correlations meaningful. Otherwise, it could just be noise that you expect to find amongst complex and multivariate data sets like those we're discussing here today. Lastly, I think it's important to make a distinction between behavioral variation and behavioral variability. These are two different concepts. Now, people do lots of things differently. In fact, almost everything we do in more than one different way. Collectively as a species, though, is different from the behavioral variability of individuals. If you look at how chimpanzees, for example, use tools, they have a very stereotyped pattern. Once they solve the problem of how to crack a nut with a bit of stone or a fish a little termite out of a termite mouth, they stick with that plan. They don't vary it unless humans intervene and force them to. On the other hand, if you look at just the basic thing like some of you are doing right here in the audience, some of you are taking notes on a pen and pencil, others are taking notes with laptops or tablets, others are not taking notes at all, and that guy back there is taking a nap. So, that capacity, and all of you have that capacity, all of you could be taking a nap right now. Probably not. That capacity for human behavioral variability is unique. It's highly derived among the primates. Basically, we have it. Our nearest primate relatives don't. And I think one of the really interesting things we need to do is, as we study variation in the archaeological record, we need to develop methods for recognizing when that variation reflects variability.